My name is Zinat Rahman. I'm the project director of the Inclusive America Project at the Aspen Institute. And today we're talking about religious communities in the US and bridging faith divides. And I would pose that religion has a PR problem in our country, that the only time we hear about religion or faith communities is around acts of violence, unfortunately, or around our most divisive cultural issues, whether the abortion debate or the masterpiece cake issue. We don't have a productive conversation around faith. And so yet, I look across this room and the stalwarts that came this early, and I see across the room people doing incredible work mobilizing faith communities towards social justice. I see Yusra and Rima and Summer and Larissa and Simran, who are all doing really important work in their communities. And so what's missing? And I would pose that there's a language piece that is missing. And if we are focused on religious pluralism as integral to democratic renewal and to solving some of our deepest, most entrenched challenges, we have to have a positive way to have this conversation. And so today we will talk about that. This is not going to be kind of your 101 interfaith conversation, but really going to be about what is religious pluralism in 2019. I'm so grateful to have these humans with me today to talk about this. And we can't bridge divides if we don't have the language to talk about it, an understanding of where other people are coming from, which is a literacy component around this, and practices that bring us together. So those are some of the things that we'll talk about. On my far left is Casper ter Kuile, who describes himself as someone who is helping to build a world of joyful belonging. I'm just going to read, because I love what you wrote on your website, that in the midst of enormous changes in how we experience community and spirituality, he connects people and co-creates projects that help us live lives of greater connection, meaning, and depth. He spends a lot of time looking at religious traditions and reimagining it for our current context. And he runs a very popular podcast called Harry Potter and the Sacred Text that made my flight over here much more enjoyable yesterday, so thank you for that.
Thank you.
Safiya Ghori-Ahmad, to his right, currently serves as the South Asia Director at McLarty Associates, which is a global consulting firm based in Washington, D.C. She has worked at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, at the State Department, on issues of democracy, human rights, and labor. She's covered South and Central Asia. She's also on the Advisory Council for the Muslim Public Affairs Council, where she advises the organization's policy and legislative strategy, and most recently was on the board of the ACLU of Arkansas, where she utilized legal strategies to combat religious discrimination and suppression of free speech. And I think I would be remiss if I didn't mention that you're a really proud Little Rock native.
Yes, I am.
And we'll mention it in any conversation you have with her.
Yes.
So, and then Ramina Shishibi is confronting the challenges of poverty and disinvestment in urban communities through a Muslim-led civic engagement effort that bridges race, class, and religion called the Inner City Muslim Action Network. He's the executive director. He's been doing that since 1997. He also has a PhD in sociology from the University of Chicago, and he's a visiting professor of sociology of religion and Muslim studies at the Chicago Theological Seminary. And I have to say, as a college student, finding my way of what my faith meant to me, Iman was integral to that. That the things that I learned in Sunday school about orthopraxy, like what your faith is, didn't feel embodied until I saw a model of community cafe and all of the different things of that you do at Iman. So I feel like a very personal connection. Of course, I'm from Chicago, so there's that. So I would like, so I don't have my first question. All right, so I want each of you to kind of talk about what is, from your point of view, the role of faith through the community that you occupy and inhabit today in 2019. And Casper, can I start with you?
Sure. Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. It is a great delight, I have to say, to finally be on a panel where I am the token person with three wonderful Muslims of color. Yeah, exactly. This is the world that I've been longing for. So my work sits kind of uncomfortably within the traditional interfaith model where We might have one person representing Judaism, one person representing Islam, one person representing Christianity. My work at the Divinity School at Harvard has looked mainly at people who see themselves outside of a religious tradition. So people like me who were born with no faith tradition, but who nonetheless are passionate about community, about meaning, about justice, and the ways in which they then organize to create those kind of communities, and the strange way in which religion keeps showing up, even though these communities are ostensibly secular. So everything from people hosting weddings and funerals in a CrossFit box, or texting their SoulCycle instructor whether they should divorce their husband at 4 p.m. on a Sunday, the kind of pastoral relationships that these secular leaders find themselves in. And so my work has been kind of to hold up a mirror to this landscape of secular communities and say, hey, actually maybe what you're doing is kind of religious. And especially to think, you were talking about orthopraxy, right action, especially communities that are built around fitness or around creativity or around justice, where there is this kind of orthopraxy vibe of right practice in what we do together to build community. So that's the kind of context. So from my vantage point, the moment that we find ourselves in is one of real radical shift, rather than the kind of story of religion traveling through pneumatic tubes. We're in this moment of great intermingling, great disruption in the language that people use to describe themselves, hybridity. People come to the Divinity School now saying, well, I'm Catholic and Presbyterian, or I'm a herbalist and yoga is my central practice, or I was raised in an interfaith household, but really I'm passionate about law and I bring a kind of Catholic social teaching with a Muslim power analysis. You get everything. And so it's a really fermenting creative time, I think, in how we think about what religion is, because so much in the American imagination, religion is shaped by what you believe in, which is a very Protestant lens to think through about what religion is. So I'm really interested in that idea of kind of challenging that PR problem, maybe, as you were saying, and looking at religion happening in unexpected places and in unexpected communities with unexpected language. And I think that's the moment we're in, that there's actually a lot of creativity and generativity in the landscape.
That's good to hear. So.
Well, Zenith mentioned I'm going to bring in Arkansas as much as I can, and you'll see me do that. But my parents came to America in the 60s and immigrated from India, and they've always lived in the South because of my dad's profession. So my parents came to Little Rock, Arkansas in 1979. And the way my dad his desire to build community and to build sort of a Muslim American presence in the South, the way that he did that was he flipped open the phone book. And he went through the names and found names where he thought, oh, this sounds like a Muslim name, this sounds like a Muslim, and called them up. And that's how the community was built. And I grew up in the Muslim community in Arkansas, which was very small. And so in 2019, when I look back at the community and broader communities of faith all across America, I see this strength in coalition building. And I've seen, I have a legal background, I'm a lawyer, and I've spent so much of my career focusing on how do we shift policies that impact faith-based communities, and how do we push on legislators and on the administration, regardless of partisanship. How do we push for better policies for people of faith and faith-based communities? And there's been such a backlash and an attack on communities, I would say even pre-9/11, but I was really focused on it post-9/11, and I've seen this real shift happening among faith-based communities, and this desire to build coalitions and to work together and to build friendships. And so one of the stories I was sharing with Zenith earlier is I was actually in Arkansas when President Trump announced the Muslim ban. And the community decided to pull together a rally on the steps of the Capitol. And amongst the organizers, the anticipated crowd was maybe 50 to 100 people. And on the morning of the rally, 5,000 Arkansans showed up at the rally. News coverage, it was splashed all over the press. And following that conversation, there have been real conversations with the National Conference of Christians and Jews, the interfaith communities, about how to include other diverse communities, the Sikh community, the Hindu community, the Muslim community, in a lot of these conversations. And so in 2019, for me, faith really is about building alliances, building friendships, and building coalitions to help shape better policies for all of us.
All right, Assalamu alaikum, peace and blessings be upon everyone, shalom, salam, and ashe. I am grateful to be here. This is my first foray into the whole Aspen experience, and so I feel like Alice in the Wonderland thing, trying to get acclimated. But it's beautiful being here, and you know, I was on a plane. I barely made it because our seats were overbooked in Chicago, but I had the chance to sit with my colleague here, Katie, in Chicago from MacArthur, and we spoke the entire time here, trying to better understand the larger kind of spectrum of conversations, and it's been exhilarating already. You know, when I think about this pluralism, so much of my perspective still is really shaped, of course, over the last 20 plus years of organizing, engaging, Chicago-centric, but we have a full-time chapter in Atlanta, and I've been privileged to go to urban and be connected with urban centers across the United States, and in some ways really even globally, you know, and seeing, and from that lens, you know, I think about pluralism and the faith role of it, and where faith plays a part in generating this, and in part it is the conversation. I never want to minimize the benefit of really getting in space and engaging one another's traditions and understanding. I was last week I was keynoting for a very dear organization to me in Chicago, the Jewish Council of Urban Affairs, and it was post-Ramadan. It was just right, and I always have to, even, you know, I never like to take for granted that people, especially among progressive liberal circles, you know, there's always this kind of, there's always a little bit of hesitancy for people just to be honest. I don't really know I don't know about your tradition, and liberals, I think, sometimes are more reluctant, quite frankly, to articulate more deep-seated anxieties that only those folks should have. Like, I shouldn't have those. But hey, listen, you're subjected to the same 30-second soundbite that most Americans are about most Muslim, you know, most traditions, especially traditions like Islam. So it's natural for you to harbor, I think, some very core questions. Plus, we're all byproducts of a still extraordinarily racialized narrative around faith in nations like the United States. And so we're still internalizing a lot of that. So I still welcome moments to just talk about basic practice and engage one another. You know, and this moment at the JCUA, I was joking with my Jewish brothers and sisters because people still trying to figure out Ramadan as much as you hear about it. And I said, listen, it's 30 days, sunrise to sunset, no food and no water. That's the whole thing that's the question. Not even water. Not even water. So I say, listen, it's like Yom Kippur times 14, right? Or to my Catholic brothers and sisters in the house, it's like Lent circa the early 11th century. You have to have these kind of moments, like where we can, you know, just share. But having said that, you know, what I think is the most resonant part of, and what really inspires me and drives me, is when I love your early description about the way in which discursive religious practices animate even things like Soul Cycle and all these things. But what I'm really inspired by is really fighting back on the idea that our traditions don't have within them deeply rooted practices that can sustain profound transformative moments of hope and redemption in our communities and society, and that's what I've seen. You know, I was in serious. You know, I was reflecting with my Jewish brothers and sisters on the notion of, you know, tshuva, as it's said in Hebrew, tauba, as it's talked about in Arabic. This idea of repentance, right? A deep idea of what literally translates in both Hebrew and Arabic as turning, right? It's the idea of turning back to your Creator. So this very personal practice of piety about turning back, acknowledging our shortcomings, acknowledging the gaps between our aspirational ideals and our lived realities. But how does that show up in the world? And I think, you know, I was citing Dietrich Bonhoeffer's extraordinary notion of false grace, the theologian, the early 20th century Protestant theologian, who of course, died on his beliefs in a Nazi concentration camp, you know, contesting the role of the silence, the complicit silence of particular religious communities, but other communities in Nazi Germany. But he spoke about false grace, and he defined it as asking for forgiveness without demanding repentance, right? And that kind of brings me to, I think, the most powerful thing that I see operationalized in a city like Chicago over the last 20 years is faith communities at their best have been these sources of helping us individually and collectively stop, recognize, and turn, right? To turn back to a greater, more pure source of what it means to be a human being, that aspirational ideals to think about. And I've seen that really in concretized ways around, criminal justice reform, around housing, around violence, when synagogues and mosques and churches are out on the streets with one another, confronting policies, confronting the silence and inequities in our own communities, and coming together and thinking about what does personal and collective toba or chuba look like when we both recognize our both personal and collective shortcomings and become a source of collective repentance, if you will, in our communities. And I think for me, that has been perhaps one of the most kind of driving inspirational forces when I have been able to sit in the pews of a church and be motivated by a Pentecostal preacher to think about criminal justice reform in a way that brings our community, or sit with a rabbi who's been able to draw deep from the tradition to challenge both his congregation and other congregations to think about how our silence or how our relationship, our comfort with certain practices need to be challenged in very authentic spiritual terms.
So I want to tie something together that both of you kind of mentioned in your remarks, which is, we don't have the spaces and places to have these conversations. And interfaith, historically, for lack of a better term for this work, has been very, narrow, has been very small. And because I think of separation of church and state, and just because of cultural issues, people are not comfortable talking about this kind of stuff in the normal public square, right? Like, it's when people know I do this work at Aspen, they'll come up and whisper to me, like, this is what I do through my church, or I do this work here, because there's no public space really to have this conversation. But one place you see that is around expressions of solidarity when something happens, right? So if Christchurch, Poway, I mean, unfortunately, you can go through the litany of examples of, houses of worship or acts of violence against faith communities that have happened in our recent history. How do we take those kind of expressions of solidarity and turn them into meaningful relationship? And so what I'm asking you to do is go a little more concrete on what is it that we do, in order to meld those spaces that are something I consider a highly specialized space, the interfaith space, and the broader, discourse. And that bridge is that opportunity when something happens, it opens up the space for conversation, for solidarity without feeling uncomfortable at asking questions, because I think you're right on the religious literacy piece. We don't have the channels, the ways to ask those conversations without feeling dumb or feeling at fault. So where do we start? Any one of you can begin if you have thoughts.
You want to? We'll kind of wave ourselves.
Yeah.
Like this.
Yeah,
I don't mind starting. But first, I want to take on the first part of the question, Zenith, because I think it's interesting. I always find that part, again, sociologically, we can't disentangle our conversations about religion or faith from our larger sets of forces and narratives. So when we look at, especially race in the United States, right? I mean, it's in many ways.
But are you saying that interfaith does that?
I'm saying that the notion that somehow we are not comfortable or don't talk about faith in public squares is so, in many ways, kind of oblivious to the extraordinary role that faith has played in the public square, and especially in this country, right? And particularly with the narratives around, and you don't go, I remember Rahm Emanuel being invited to one of his early breakfasts, and he was still he was wrestling with the faith kind of language, our mayor in Chicago. And I was me and a rabbi, and the rest of the room were black pastors, a lot of whom I was organizing with, and he, and I understand where he was coming from and how he wrestled with it, but he said something that I looked at his aide, I was like, no, don't ever say this. He got up and he looked at a room of black pastors. He said, look, you all have your lane, right? Essentially, like you do what you all do, right? The religious stuff, and we do this political. I'm the mayor. We do the. I was like, you don't say that. Like you don't say that in Chicago. You don't say that to black pastors who've been on the forefront of challenging and organizing. It's like this kind of. But it was in some ways a manifestation of a very kind of bifurcated way in which we have these conversations about the role of faith in the public square, right? Yeah. I mean, hip hop as a conduit of black and brown communities was convenient. I mean, faith was ever present in the public square of hip hop. From the early days of Wu-Tang and Eric B. and Rakim, it was always part of that public square. So the question is, what public square are you talking about? And who's having those conversations? And what are the origins of your hang-ups with talking about faith more honestly in these places? Because when you go to the communities that are on the ground, like you said, Zena, most of them, and I've had these conversations in philanthropic spaces now across, and I think even among the foundations, to be more honest that, you don't go do a site visit and pretend like faith isn't playing the role,
work
right?
Without faith communities.
Because you create this very artificial, schizophrenic way in which people have to start talking about their work. Like I only talk about it with this language within this realm, and I try to ignore this extraordinary force that drives and animates so much of what I do. So that's that one part. But on the very quick 30 seconds on your institutionalization moment, I think the other piece of what we have, I think, as a larger society become almost ritualized into appreciating is the role faith plays in moments of crisis, right? The day after, right? Whatever that is, the day after X, you say that, morning after, the faith convening, the mass shooting, it's almost kind of, again, perfunctory on some level. You bring the imam, you bring the rabbi, you bring the folks, and you all pray together. And again, I'm not minimizing the power and meaning of that, but again, for those who begin to appreciate the historical role that faith traditions have had in animating extraordinary, movement, change, and meaning-making communities, we have to build up institutions that can sustain that. And I think that's an important point that we have to begin to realize, because if those institutions that are, you cannot just go to for instance, the American Muslim community the day after and, a certain attack and get them engaged and not realize that community without long-term civic infrastructure is never going to be the partner you need them to be without, an investment in building up institutions. And I think that's the pivot we need to make on that.
I think that's important. I think I don't want to lose the fact that that's an opportunity to open the aperture, because we have kind of, and this is always a tension, I think, especially in the space, or those of us who have worked in the space for a while, is how do you balance a rapid response, which is let's fund a community who is under duress, and this is not even a faith thing, but versus what is the long-term institutional structures that need to be built in order for the we, like who is the we when you say we? But I want to go to the others, and so Casper and then Safiya.
Yeah, so my perspective is thinking, again, for the folks outside of religious traditions who we've learned are hungry for spiritual permission. So I might just mention the podcast, Harry Potter and the Sacred Text, where we read Harry Potter as if it was a sacred text, by which I mean we turn to these books with reading practices drawn from Judaism and Christianity that help us dig deeper into the text and really to turn to it as a mirror for our own lives and for our own experiences. And what's been so interesting is that the kind of the permission for friendship and for alliances and for power building at an institutional level, I feel is completely mirrored at an individual level, where when we bring folks together who obviously listen mostly alone, there's a real there's a joy of just finding other people who do this thing and who take one another seriously enough in this textual study. So we, that tradition of textual study obviously goes way back. We're just changing the text. And I think the kind of the shift that happens with people's own labeling of who am I and what does this mean to me opens really interesting doors of then what can we do together? Because if you're turning towards a text and so every week we read through a specific theme, so it might be love or forgiveness or revenge, and have conversations about what those themes look like in our own lives and in the world around us, that we're really practicing, it's a kind of moral cultivation. It's a formation process. The stories we hear of individuals who say, you know what, having done this, I've now decided to adopt, or I've decided to volunteer in this way, or I've decided I need to quit my job and do something that's more meaningful and engaged in what I care about. I think that's what's really exciting about that kind of permission giving, of saying, like, even if you don't fit within this box, like, these questions, these longings are real and authentic, and you can take them seriously. So there's a real opportunity there, I think, to actually bring these practices, as Rami was saying, that have so much power, not as a stealth tactic to, like, let's bring them in secretly and then everyone's going to be Christian, Jewish, whatever, but to let the practices speak for themselves and say, you know, I'm open to whatever language you use to describe it, but try this, because it's what's helped human beings be human for so long.
Safiya, can I add a layer to the question before you respond, which is that, you know, we're in a circumstance right now where there's government-sanctioned bigotry against a particular faith community with the Muslim ban. And, you know, so when Rami talks about kind of this long-term institution building necessary, especially in these minority faith communities that are so nascent, and the volume of response that they have to do on any given day actually prevents that long term, because they're always in rapid response. But can you just talk about the arc of that? I know you were in Little Rock, I think, when the Muslim ban happened, but
sure.
on the policy level, and then also, you know, how has it affected that community in particular?
Sure. So just actually yesterday was the 1-year anniversary that marked the Supreme Court upholding the Muslim ban. So over the last year, I was kind of reflecting on all of the challenges and all of the sort of battles that, as a faith-based community and a civil rights community, and all of the sort of coalitions that have come together, all the battles that have been fought. And it was really enlightening to me to think that in the last year or two, since Trump actually announced, and then since the Supreme Court upheld the ban, there have been 100 individual cases that have been fought. 11 attempts by the federal court to uphold, to actually block the ban. 5 arguments before the Supreme Court. So these are real, tangible results that have occurred, and they're not just, those battles aren't just being fought by the Muslim American community. So the sort of, there's been 4 pieces of legislation that have been introduced since the Muslim ban was upheld. 4 pieces of legislation. 90 members of Congress have signed on to this piece of legislation, the No Ban Act. And 400 faith-based groups have come together to not just sign a letter, but to pound the pavement and knock on doors of members of Congress. So the Interfaith Council, the National Conference of Christians, the ACLU, the Muslim Community, Muslim MPAC, and Muslim Advocates, the ADL. So we have substantially sort of created a group of advocates that are trying to fight the ban on the Hill, at the Supreme Court, with the administration. And it's really created this momentum where there's so many stories out there that resonate with across the board with people of faith. And I've seen it actually, and I talk about this a lot, is in the South, the reason when I was growing up, the reason why I felt sort of understood is because there's so much faith in the public space, right? Christians, although they've tried to convert me all the time, but I've been to many Southern Baptist churches for many occasions, but I feel like it was very much an understood part of our life is the fact that the faith is such a prevalent part of who we are. And I really saw this sort of coming together around the fact that 5 Muslim countries are a part of this ban. Families are being separated. They can't get work visas. They can't get family visas. They can't get visitor visas. Immigration and refugee resettlement has gone down 2-fold since the last year. And is this something as a country, is this who we are? And this is really a moment across the board, across political spectrums that has united people. And so I really see this moment as, you know, we can reflect on the fact that the ban is still here. It's impacting lives of people, thousands of people in this country, largely Muslims from Muslim countries. And you can think about that, but then you can also reflect on the fact that over the last year, this intense level of advocacy has occurred amongst communities of faith and communities across the civil rights spectrum and civil society groups who have come together to push back on this. And so I think it's really a moment of reflection to think about how we're building those communities and how we're fighting back. One of the things that Rami said about this moment of crisis and how it's always the day after, and my belief is always that we have to have a seat at the table when things are good. We have to be part of the conversation when things are going great, because to come in at the 11th hour when there's a crisis is too late. And I think about the fact that the Department of Justice, and I'm, having lived in DC now for almost 15 years, the Department of Justice convenes these civil rights, civil liberties monthly meetings where they call in the Sikh American community, the Muslim community, communities of faith that were impacted post 9/11. And so these meetings are still taking place, but they've morphed into a real conversation about strategies towards protecting the civil rights of faith-based communities. And so the first 2 years, 3 years that I was going, I was like, man, these meetings are not going anywhere. What is that actually achieving? But 15 years down the line, I see that there is a pipeline for a process where the Department of Justice takes federal hate crimes seriously.
But before we jump on to another question.
I have something to add to that.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Is there a way to do this in a bipartisan way? If you don't want to take it, you don't have to. But it occurs to me a lot of this conversation is very kind of left of center.
I think there is a way to do this in a bipartisan way. I think if you look at the candidates, the 2020 candidates, Pete Buttigieg talks about faith in a way that I don't think has really been heard in at least over the last 10, 20 years. He talks about his faith in a very real way. You hear presidential candidates, you hear sort of the conversation around the role that faith plays in our lives, and it really resonates with people. I think it's part of the conversation, and it's becoming a way that the sort of left and the Democratic Party is trying to bring back people into the party. But you also see this real humanitarian face of the Muslim ban, and on the immigration issues such as the migrant crisis on the border, you see this face of the crisis. You see children in detention centers, and I think that resonates on a bipartisan level. Whether that is shifting policy, I think we still have a ways to go on that. But I think in terms of civil society, I think it is a bipartisan issue.
Yeah.
You don't have to jump in on that.
No, but I think I will say something about that, because I think therein lies a really big, you mentioned Pete Buttigieg. I think part of what he's leaning into is to try to recover the conversation of faith, to be more of a vehicle to kind of bridge this, only, Republican conservatives talk about faith and we talk about it in different ways, which is so, again, not aligned with the experiences of so many communities that have been on the ground, who've been owning it and claiming it and engaging it in ways so I think that open up very meaningful pathways to something that go well beyond bipartisanship for me, which is if you have human proximity, if you're challenging one another, these narratives, I gave a talk once in Louisville, and a woman came up to me and said, "You said such amazing things. I was so moved about what you said. Give me one thing to say about Islam to my rural Kentucky family that could kind of disarm them of all of the prejudices." I said, what am I going to say? I love Jesus too. I do. It's like the conversion stuff. Do you love Jesus? I love Jesus. My mother was born outside a dirt road in Bethlehem. How more Jesus-like can we be, right? And so, but it's, though it's at that point, it's not conversations of points of faith. It's, look, are we willing as a country, as a society, to deconstruct the things that have disarmed us from really operationalizing the core tenets of our faith? And certainly white supremacy is one of those things that we've all been infected by, right? And racialized narratives, whether you came here as an Arab or a Latino, or whether you came here as a Lithuanian immigrant fleeing, we've all been infected by this in one way or the other. We're all still dealing with the residue of it, and it inhibits our way of having honest conversations about what real reconciliation can look like, and I think therein lies the role of faith. I would say something also about institutionalization. There's 30 seconds. Because I do think practically what gives me hope in places like Chicago, at least, and that's again where the granular, I see 3 ways in which, if you're coming from the academy, whether you're coming from the private sector, or whether you're coming from philanthropy. Let me give you 3 ways in which I think people are taking now definitive steps to make.
You said private sector,
private
academy,
sector, the academy, and philanthropy, to make good on getting, beyond the day after dynamic, right? One, philanthropy now more than, Iman, I can speak, Iman's been around for 21 years. More in the last 5 years, we've seen more increased sensibility of multi-year general operating support to build infrastructure and capacity. Katie's here from MacArthur. MacArthur's now being able to provide resources to organizations that are building out capacity, that are building out, the basic infrastructures that's the hardest thing to fund to build institutions. Absolutely. Typically foundations are wanting, outcomes on a program as opposed to, hey, build up the infrastructure of your nonprofit so that you can be here to sustain and build. And that's the hardest thing. But if you could be a champion for that type of sustained engagement in philanthropic, whether it's family philanthropy or big philanthropy, that's an important moment.
Can I add one more to that, just because this is a space I work in? It's also lower the barriers to entry. And so realizing like faith communities have such little capacity. American Muslim community on average has 1.3 employees of their nonprofits. I imagine the Sikh communities even lower than, there's like one Sikh, National Sikh organization, I think. And so
Iman's been around
philanthropy needs to be more accessible if we really want to work with faith communities.
And for us, we've been around 20 plus years, but we're like dinosaurs now in the American Muslim community. Really, in terms of, not to say that there's a rich tradition, especially in the Black American Muslim tradition of activism engagement, but I'm talking about nonprofit institution building, right? Most of them have emerged really in full in the last 10 years or so, and yes, very much anemic. So that's one, philanthropy. The second is the private sector. I mean, the private sector, there are voices within various, whether we were talking with PayPal folks here, we're talking about, we got partners at Blue Cross Blue Shield. We need champions within the private sector that are gonna find more sustained, engaged ways beyond the corporate workday to come down to the South Side, which is, I'm not minimizing the value of that, the service day, but how do you then agitate internally to turn a service day to feel like, what corporate citizenship could look like into more sustained ways in which you take, 2 or 3 nonprofits in a particular community and say, we're gonna remain committed to that for the next 10 years. And we're gonna build with them. And we're gonna leverage our expertise, we're gonna leverage, our infrastructure to really help build out the infrastructure of these institutions. And when that starts to happen, I think you're going to start seeing these really unique types of relationships emerge in cities like Chicago, where there's such extraordinary, still sustained disparity between the corporate sector and between communities that are hurting. And lastly, the academy, right? Which I've had a privilege of being on both sides, working in the nonprofit space, but also working in the academy. When any institution that I've taught in has started saying, like, we want to put fellows in communities and stuff like that, I said, that's great, but I've also been on the back end of that. And the graduate student goes there for a quarter and may never come back, may do some great research that nobody's in that community will ever see again, right? Or ever even hear about. But what if as academic institutions, especially huge ones like UC or Northwestern or others, and begun to make a commitment to the places where we're sending our students, to the neighborhoods, to the communities. Again, not 2-year commitments, not 3 years, but 10-year commitments that have, we will also deepen the infrastructure of these nonprofits that we are sending our students to so that we can be real long-term partners with. So just kind of put that out there because I think those are sometimes you have these conceptual ideas about, okay, we want to build institutions, how can you do it? I think there are multiple ways which we can, creatively just turn up the heat in our various institutions to go beyond, what has been comfortable maybe.
So we have 10 minutes. I'm going to move to Q&A after one more question that I have for this group. Actually, I have many, but I'm only going to ask one. Actually, I'll ask you all maybe different questions because I do want to get to the syncretism question with you, Casper, which is to say, I think a lot of times the reason that people don't want to come to interfaith conversations traditionally is the lowest common denominator, right? Which is like, let's all agree on X and dilute everything that else is that's distinct and different about our faith. And you talk about kind of this dynamic, bring multiple sides of your personality to these spaces that you're creating. How do you avoid syncretism in that? But you guys have to keep these responses like super short, especially you. I love you. I can listen to you all day. There's
a lot of good stories.
There's a lot of
I'm like the rabbi and pastor. Although I'm not an imam, but I have like 4 or 5 different endings.
So syncretism, allyship, and then white supremacy, and we got to do that in 30 seconds each.
All right.
I'll say that the gatherings that we've hosted of community leaders from secular and religious contexts, the most effective thing has been practicing together. And to not go to a lowest common denominator, which ultimately still kind of looks like a Protestant worship service, but to fully dive into one another's practice and tradition. And so, when we brought people together, there's always morning practices to start the day. And so you can join someone for like 45 minutes of Shabbat singing, or a kind of a secular meditation, or an experience of Muslim prayer, or a Afro-flow yoga journey through time with your body. And it's my experience. I love that comment around friendship. That the way in which we actually build relationships and understanding is to discover the beauty of one another's traditions and to actually feel more confident in kind of claiming those and with relationship and with respect, but even adopting some of those practices in our own lives.
Yeah.
I think you can do that with integrity.
Thank you. Safiya, I want to ask a question about allyship, which is, we there's a lot of language around that actually, but what are kind of the specific components, or how do you think about allyship in this moment of all these other buzz terms, right? Intersectionality, all these things that are kind of floating in the air. I think that's a concrete thing that we need to name and mention as an important part of how communities come together.
One of the examples that I want to share is, I would say maybe 10 years ago in the post 9/11 space, when I was working on some of these issues, there was a real discomfort in the Muslim community and the Jewish community as well to sort of develop this, outspoken formal alliance with the ACLU because of their positions on a lot of social issues. There was a lot of discomfort around, do we want to support them on this issue and that issue? And I would say now, when it comes, that organization has stood with so many communities of color and immigrant and minority communities over the last few years. I think there has been sort of a formal alliance that we will be there for you, you will be there for us, we will use our resources, we will leverage those relationships. These organizations like the ADL and the ACLU have been around for years and years and years, much longer than a lot of the American Muslim organizations. And it's really about creating a uniform message, at least to shift policy. So when members of Congress see a constituency, it's just the Muslim community, it's just the Jewish community, oh, it's just the ACLU, so it's just a bunch of liberal civil liberties folks. But when they see it all together and they see it all walking into a room together, it's a real powerful moment, and it causes them to really listen. And I've seen that shift happen on the Hill. I've seen it on pieces of legislation. I've seen it really to help shift policy. And so one of the organizations that I'm affiliated with is MPAC, and I actually worked for the organization when Zenith and I met many, many years ago. Is what they're doing is they're placing young people in congressional offices. And 10 years ago, this didn't exist. I know other communities do this, but the Muslim American community was not able to effectively put young people who are interested in policy and helping to push the policy discussion forward, place them in members' offices. So this year, MPAC is hosting about 15 young people on the Hill. They're working in Senator Feinstein's office, Senator Booker's office. They're working Senator Kane's office. So influential offices, not just Democrats. They're working on committees. They're working for Republicans. And that's how we push the conversation forward on the policy side.
Thank you, Safiya. So Rami, I want you to kind of answer that allyship question, but also you had mentioned how we're all, we're still reacting to and living within kind of the structure of white supremacy, right? Which can feel blaming towards people who come from the majority community. And then you also said in an earlier comment that we have to create spaces in a way to do this that people can have honest conversations without shame, right? That they can come to these and say, I don't actually know about your tradition. Can you tell me? Can you tie those things together
I'll try.
a little bit? And so how do you do this in a respectful way? Have these the entrenched conversations that we need to have as a country are really difficult conversations to have.
Right.
And how do we do that in a way that doesn't feel like I'm right, you're wrong, zero-sum game,
Okay,
but
I'll
is
try.
actually productive, but you have 30 seconds. Fine, 45.
All right.
Just kidding.
So very, very quickly on the allyship, I think the one problem I have with that term is, again, it creates dialectic still for me. The us, them, I'm allying with you, and there's lots of value in it, but I really, as a community organizer, my brother back here, Juan, who's now the chancellor of the City of Colleges, we come out of a tradition that talks about what it means in cities like Chicago to expand collective self-interest. I'm not there because I'm there simply because I'm your ally. I'm there because I understand our collective self-interest. We're affected by this issue. And we have to, and again, I think faith can be an extraordinary role that challenges us to expand what our narrow notions of self-interest have been defined as. And that then links to the notion of white supremacy. Listen, we're all affected. I mean, I think the most problematic aspects of conversations about white supremacy is to think that those who quote unquote are self-identified as white are the only folks affected by white supremacy. That's simply not true.
Right.
I mean, look, my mother who came to defend, you know, she lived in that world. She was a refugee from 1948, grew up on the south side of Chicago, a very bifurcated black-white narrative, but they found themselves embedded in the consequences of that narrative as this one Palestinian Arab family was moving from Inglewood, Stony Island into Marquette Park alongside white working class folks who were fleeing these neighborhoods because realtors were creating mass havoc and extraordinary fear that your entire life's savings as a Lithuanian Polish Catholic person is going to go down the drain because this young black kid and their family that's moving in from the projects for Good Hope, all your value is going to happen. And that's how neighborhoods were flipped. It was called block busting, and there's a whole literature about that. The point, I think, to say for me, how to demonstrate that is in practice, going back practice. The most powerful illustration in the last 20 years has been our work, and Juan was involved with that, about creating the memorial to Martin Luther King and the freedom marchers on the south side of Chicago in a park where King was viciously stoned, where my mom grew up in 1966 in August during the Chicago Freedom Summer. And being able to mount this alliance for over 2 years with Black, Latino, churches, communities from all across, to build a memorial that both memorialized that pain, but also lifted up what a vision of the beloved community looks like, and connected to ongoing organizing campaigns, was the most healing, therapeutic kind of thing that we have ever been involved with. And I think it's kind of this idea of calling out, but also calling up, I think is where the faith tradition comes in. You know, we can call out white supremacy, we call out structural inequities, but I think faith challenges us when it's operating at its best to call up.
Thank you, Rami. So I'm going to do a round of questions and then have them answer and / close. And I'm sorry that we're running out of time. You guys should wait for the mic. This gentleman in the blazer, then Larissa, then Black Cap. Can you just say who you are?
Hi, I'm Gary Sherwin. I'm from Southern California, Orange County. And first off, Casper, I don't know how many of your listeners on your Harry Potter broadcast are over 50, but I am one of them, and I find it fascinating. You guys do a great job with it.
You do a good job.
The question I have is really about the role of the media in all of this. Particularly on the progressive side, which you would normally think would be a natural ally. But there are people, say, for example, Bill Maher, who's normally very progressive on a lot of things. He's taken a very hard line on Islam. And he's basically said, if you like to see women wearing burqas, you can't support this faith. So how do you go beyond that when you have people like that who are cherry-picking certain aspects of your faith, which frankly you could do for all faiths.
Yep.
But it seems Islam seems to get the brunt of a lot of that and demonizes the faith, and that kind of impedes our ability to build bridges.
Thank you. Great question. Larissa?
Hi, I'm Larissa from Sojourners. I think my question will build on that, which is how do we scale religious literacy? And I think that's a particularly challenging question because I think it needs to be scaled for those who don't realize that they need more religious literacy. And some of those folks who need it are consider themselves religious themselves.
Right.
Both the intra-religious literacy as well as the interfaith understanding of other faiths as well.
What does my faith tradition say about engaging the other? I mean, that's, and then the gentleman in front of her.
It was a great conversation, by the way. Being a psychologist, Reformed Jew, and an atheist, my question is, would religion as well as humanity be better served without the concept of God? We spoke here for 40 minutes, and you never mentioned God, which I applaud all of you for. And I'm dead serious, because I think there's a lot that all religions can engage in, but we default to the argument, my God's this, my God's that, my God says this, and it gets pretty silly at that point.
All right, no, so we're out of time, so, but I want to give you all a chance to respond.
Can you just say your last 30-second point?
Go ahead.
Okay, I have a question. Since 1976 or maybe later, 1979, the Iranian hostage crisis, the theocracy in Iran and the shouting of death to the America, and the whole concept in the media of Islam against the infidels of the West. How does the media, how can you guys use the media to unite people and change that narrative? Because I think that's one of the most interesting things. We've created this narrative that absolutely is not true.
All right, so we have questions about how do you scale religious literacy, the concept of God in terms of dividing and not uniting, and then the role of media. And I would love you guys to close out kind of on a hopeful note. I'm sorry I didn't do a good job as a moderator to stay on time, but hopefully you'll hang out with us for 2 more minutes while we finish up. There's a beautiful hadith from my tradition that the prophet is reported to have said that even if you have a sapling, and even if the day of resurrection is upon you, so the day of judgment is the next day, you should still plant that seed or plant that tree. And it's such a beautiful thing of like, we always talk about the bad things about this space. Like, what is the hopeful note that we are ending on? And you all can kind of go in whatever order that you would like.
Sure, I can start. On the media piece, I'll give my own sort of personal example, having grown up here and born and raised in this country. I have 2 little boys, and I'm raising them on the East Coast. I'm raising them in a much more different environment than I was raised. Their public school in Arlington, Virginia looks like the UN. It's amazingly diverse. I go into the school and talk about Ramadan and my tradition every year. There are so many more visible Muslim people in the public space. We went to New York recently, and we get off the train, and Hassan Minhaj's Patriot Act is the first thing you see in Times Square. There's a show on Hulu called Rami, which is all about the American Muslim experience. I mean, this was like unheard of growing up, 30 years ago. And
so it's happening.
So I think it's happening. I think the conversation is shifting. I think there's a need and there's a thirst for people to see this part of what is it like in a daily life of an American Muslim, and what are the daily struggles that we deal with. It's very similar to the daily struggles of everyone else here, and it normalizes things. On the media question, I think that's seriously, as Zinat said, we have a PR problem, and I've been saying that for the last 10 years, and it's been really a struggle to sort of engage a lot of these journalists to sort of say, hey, bring me onto your show. I can show you that I'm an American Muslim, and I can, talk about these issues in a very normal way, and I think that continues to be a struggle. And just the one piece that I'd end on, sort of on a positive piece, is when we were doing a lot of this coalition building around the Muslim ban, there was a Jewish rabbi who was in one of these conversations, and he looked at me and he said, I'm not helping you because you're Jewish. I'm helping you because I'm Jewish. Yep. And I thought that really made such a huge impact on me, because it talks about how in everyone's, across the board in faith communities, the barriers are much lower than we actually think in terms of how we engage one another.
Thank you, Safiya.
I'll speak briefly just maybe to the literacy and the media piece. I think it's really important that Pete Buttigieg is gay, and that he's talking about religion. I think there's still a dominant narrative that religion equals like anti-women or anti-LGBT, which of course is such a caricature, although not always. So thinking about like messengers as well as the message, I think there's a really important opportunity to seek out voices that one wouldn't think of as engaging religious tradition. And I feel like I'm on a soapbox, so forgive me, but the stories that I'm drawing from are from the podcast. And when we engage a new practice, whether it's Chavruta or Lectio Divina or Marginalia, like these different textual traditions, we always bring in a rabbi or a priest or someone from a tradition who can describe what the practice is and help us to learn it before we engage it. And so an audience that would have never sought out religion per se is like, oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that. This is cool. And to really fall in love with the tradition rather than just like learning about it because it's a civic duty. I think it's about revealing the treasures that are within these traditions that can help us live lives of meaning and justice and connection.
It's beautiful.
I would say just, I feel this about most things, but certainly in religious traditions, what you are looking for, you will find, right?
yes.
And if you are looking for illustrations of, and so the question is, who is looking for it, what, and why? I would still say, in spite of that, you're going to find whatever you need to look for in every tradition to reinforce whatever thing you want to reinforce. And I would suggest that most secular, quote unquote, I have a problem with that dialectic between the secular and the sacred, but you know, I think you would find that there as well. We have no shortage of examples of our great secular philosophies, from eugenics to everything down on, that are ripe with just horrific things that have been catastrophic in the human experience. What gives me hope is, I think more than ever now, people are recognizing and finding ways of reclaiming what I think are central in these traditions. In the Muslim tradition, you don't need to be a scholar to argue with the fact that mercy is at the core of our tradition, mercy and justice. What mercy looks like in the world, and being able to speak very explicitly about the Most High, the Divine, Hashem, Allah, I think is an important part of the conversation, because that brings us into a space where I may not have the fullest understanding of you, but I could have an appreciation about how you connect to the Most High, something greater than yourself, and be manifestations of that. And I believe now I've been more privileged than I've ever seen, that to be in spaces and places across lots of political ideologies and spectrums, where that conversation is not only happening, but it's translating into real action on the ground. And that does give me meaningful hope, even in spite of, I think, the extraordinary challenges still before us.
Thank you all. Thank you all for being here. Join me in being
Thank you, Zina.